Ladies and gentlemen, my guest today is somebody who actually elevated the level of United States counter cyber threat preparedness to a proper command, which means that he actually brought it in right in there at the level of other combatant commands that the United States has, like the Pacific or the other commands which look at the real and physical danger. Not to say that Admiral Mike Rogers does not look at real and present danger. In fact, probably the most omnipotent and omnipresent danger is something that the Admiral specializes in. Admiral, welcome to NDTV.
Thank you. A pleasure to be back. Thank you for the opportunity.
Admiral, I wish to ask you that despite all the awareness from the last elections, last presidential elections in the United States, again we are seeing a host of state actors, that is if the American side is to be believed, a host of state actors which are now actively meddling in the United States elections.
Yes, that is true. And when we say meddling or attempting to influence the U.S. elections, in the U.S. structure generally means three different components. The first component is voting machines, the voting rolls, the actual physical process of voting. That's one element. The second element generally we paid attention to was the candidates and the parties themselves, attempts to gain access to their emails, to their data. And then thirdly was broad attempts to try to influence the American electorate with misinformation, disinformation, propaganda, manipulation of either data, video, or images and facts. And if you look at those three categories, what the US government has been saying is we still have not seen significant attempts to actually, if you will, forestall our ability to physically conduct the election. But what we are seeing, though, are significant efforts. First, I'd highlight the Iranians have penetrated the networks of the two primary candidates, former President Trump as well as Vice President Harris. And then thirdly, we're seeing significant efforts by the Russians, by the Chinese to attempt to influence, if you will, the broader US public around the election in the form of using misinformation, disinformation, manipulating images so that they are actually false and tell a different story. Sadly, this is a trend we've watched in 2016, 2020, it seemed to get a little bit better. 2024, it seems like it's moving up again.
Admiral, for a moment, completely speak like a neutral expert and not like an American expert, and then try and answer this question. How significant do you think these threats are? Of course, some amount of interference, some amount of meddling, when there is a large democratic exercise is there, just as Indian elections or American elections would always be attempted by the non-democratic players of the international polity or the International Committee of Nations. But how significant is that meddling? And speak like a completely neutral man, Admiral.
So the million-dollar question always was, so does this influence, or these attempts, if you will, to influence, does it have a material impact? Does it actually change the outcome of the election, or does it influence in a significant way? And the shorter answer is you just don't know because you're trying to prove a negative. Having said that, if I was asked to characterize, well, how would you describe the impact of this? I would say, number one, it's a significant level of effort that's being done. And as you point out, it's not unique to the United States. You see this in almost every major democracy. America, just because of its size and its visibility, tends to be a particularly tempting target, so to speak. But it's not the only one around the world that's experiencing these challenges. If you ask me to assess, so you can't prove a negative, but what do you think is the impact? I don't think it changes the results, so to speak. But on the other hand, I think it's fair to say it injects a whole lot more uncertainty. It injects a whole lot more frustration.
So in any case, if it injects a lot more uncertainty, to use your words, then surely it is not something of a healthy trend for the democracy, for any democracy.
No, it is not. This is not a healthy thing, which is one reason why, and again, the United States is the only nation doing this, but if you look at the 2024 election cycle we are dealing with here in America right now, which will be culminated in early November when we have our general elections, you're seeing that's one reason why, number one, the government in the US has opted to be very public about what it is seeing. Number two, it's opted to do it early. It's not waiting until the week before the election. You've seen the US government speaking out and about these concerns now for multiple months. And thirdly, you've seen the US government put a lot of resources in trying to understand the nature of the activity, trying to understand who is doing it, for what purpose. In my previous life, as you've indicated, when I was in the US government leading US Cyber Command, and I was the director of the National Security Agency, I was heavily involved, for example, in the 2016 efforts to identify Russian meddling activity, which was significant. So there's a reason why you're seeing a lot of emphasis by the US government on all this.
There is a reason why we are seeing it quite clearly. I mean, there has to be a reason when agencies, including now the FBI, the Federal Bureau, has registered an official case against this kind of cyber threat to the elections.
Oh, yes. You see multiple. The federal government here in America tries to bring the full spectrum of its capabilities, from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, very law enforcement focused, from Department of Homeland Security, the Cyber and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA, which is very focused on the status of our networks, our data, and our computer systems, as well as parts of the Department of Defense like the National Security Agency and Cyber Command. It's a broad effort.
And do you think that, it's always the case with the bad guys versus the good guys. The bad guys would generally try and keep a step ahead of the good guys if we were to categorize them like that. But do you think that once you bring in the full spectrum of the governmental effort or the state effort, a reasonable check or a reasonable control can be exercised on such attacks?
I think it's reasonable, but the greatest challenge is, and again, this is a challenge for India as well, for every democracy where freedom of speech and the freedom of expression are a core part of the nation's ethos, if you will, the way the nation is set up and structured, when the protection of free speech is so important, then the government placement of restrictions, if you will, becomes very challenging in a society that says, look, I don't want the government involved in attempting to censor or attempting to screen. So you're always trying to strike a balance. And that's one area where, if you will, our adversaries here have a bit of advantage, because they use our very freedoms, like freedom of expression, against us to attempt to try to manipulate, to attempt to try to keep us, if you will, divided.
Admiral, one part of this entire problem, so to say, and a large part, is surely the big tech. I mean, if you didn't have constant flow of information on your fingertips, like through the X, formerly Twitter, or other modes which have been now made possible by the big tech, the disinformation campaigns or the disinformation attempts would also have been certainly much slower, like they were in the past, and much less overwhelming or much underwhelming, so to say. Do you think the big tech is actually doing what it is supposed to do when it comes to counter such threats, or do you think their participation is more involuntary than voluntary?
Look, I think it's fair to say, my opinion, we have not yet struck the right balance between what's appropriate in terms of levels of control for the information. What I care about is when I'm looking at something on my social media accounts, when I'm looking at something online, I want to have confidence that it's accurate, that the individual or source is actually the individual or source. It's not some group of Russians, for example, in an internet structure in St. Petersburg. It's actually who they say they are. that the images aren't being distorted, if you will, and that the data that's being presented to me is factually correct. And then I should be able to make up my own mind about, is it good, is it bad, do I believe it or do I not believe it? How does it impact my political views? I mean, in a perfect world, that's our goal. To do that, we're going to need a close cooperation between the government and the technical sector, particularly the technical world that both can help us generate technical solutions to this problem set, but also, quite frankly, it's the private sector that owns the platforms that are being used to disseminate, whether that be through print, through traditional television, which are much more minor than they used to be, and now increasingly the power of social media, whether that be in, Instagram, X, etc. That's really where the greatest flow of information, where the majority of citizens today are getting their information and forming their opinions. And so, I think I don't think we're where we need to be yet. I will acknowledge that the owners of those platforms are trying to get better at it. I accept that. I still think there's more to be done, though.
More to be done, though. And then my question,
Yes.
Admiral, would be that, United States, of course, world's most technically advanced, technologically advanced country. Most of these platforms are based out of United States. And when it comes to a country like India, which usually struggles to get cooperation from these platforms, and technology obviously is not at those advanced levels at those of United States, it becomes all the more challenging.
There's challenge here for all of us. There is no doubt.
You won't say it is more challenging for democracies like India?
No, I think it's inherently challenging with any democracy, because the challenge is the government doesn't own or control the sources of information, if you will. And it's not just a technical solution. This is about, within a democracy in which the freedom of expression is so important, how do you, between government and the private sector, how do you apply both technology as well as a broader set of practices by the owners or the host of the platforms to try to make sure the information being presented is the identity of the entity is accurate, the visuals aren't distorted, and that the content is factually accurate? That remains a challenge for all of us.
My final question to you, Admiral, before I let you catch that train to Washington, is that, do you think that in the coming days, with both the big tech and the anti-democracy players, let me call them like that, let me not name anyone, but let me call them anti-democracy players, do you think it is going to only intensify, or do you think at some point in time an equilibrium would be found where states would be able to sort of hold that line, if I use the military language?
Right. I hope in the long run we manage to find an equilibrium, because there will be a compromise here. It's about a balance. I acknowledge that. On the other hand, the reality is in the near term, it's going to get worse before it gets better, in part because many of these actors are just finding that it's effective and it's working for them. So they are not going to stop.
Thank you, Admiral. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
And I wish you luck with your preparations for the general elections in the United States, the presidential elections.
Thank you, sir.